August 13th, 1704. The morning sun rose over the fields of Bavaria, lighting up the mist like fire over water. In that moment, 56,000 Allied soldiers under John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, faced the might of 60,000 French and Bavarian troops. Europe was trembling. If France won here, no power could stop Louis XIV from ruling the continent. But Marlborough was no ordinary commander. He was a strategist born from struggle, a man who fought not for glory, but for balance, for freedom, for the future of Europe itself. This was the day destiny turned. This was Blenheim, the battle that changed the course of history, August 13th, 1704. The first light of dawn stretched across the Bavarian fields, breaking through the mist that clung to the ground like a ghost. The smell of damp earth mixed with the metallic scent of weapons and armor. Thousands of soldiers stood in uneasy silence, their breath visible in the morning air. Ahead of them, beyond the haze, waited an army twice their number, an army believed to be invincible, led by the pride of France. Europe held its breath. The French king, Louis XIV, had long dreamed of complete dominance. His armies had marched unchallenged for decades, and his enemies were either crushed or trembling. But now, on the banks of the Danube, stood one man who dared to defy him, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. Marlborough was no reckless warrior. He was a man of vision, a strategist who saw the field of battle like a chessboard. He knew that today would not only decide the fate of armies, but the destiny of nations. As he rode along the front lines, his eyes were calm, his expression unreadable. The men who looked up to him saw not just a commander, but a man who carried the weight of a continent on his shoulders. The allied army of England, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire was tired, outnumbered, and deep in enemy territory. Yet Marlborough's voice carried with steady conviction, reminding them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Across the field, the French and Bavarian commanders, Tallard and Marsin, were confident. They had the numbers, the position, and the prestige of being the king's chosen generals. To them, this battle was already won. They mocked the Allies as amateurs, believing Marlborough had made a fatal mistake by marching so far from supply lines. The French soldiers, well-fed and well-rested, were certain victory was at hand. The arrogance in their camp was thick enough to taste. Yet as the morning sun burned through the fog, Marlborough saw something they did not: the terrain, the rhythm, the subtle imbalance in their formation. He had studied every inch of the land. He saw the villages of Blenheim, Oberglau, and Lutzingen stretched across the enemy's front like a chain of defense. He noticed the Danube behind them, a silent trap that would soon become their prison. Marlborough's mind raced, his instinct whispering that victory would not come from brute force, but from deception. His plan was daring, too daring for most generals to attempt. He would strike hard on the enemy's flanks to draw them in, make them believe he was retreating, and then crush their center when it was weakest. It was a gamble against impossible odds. The cannons roared, tearing through the silence of dawn. The ground shook beneath the soldiers' feet as waves of smoke rolled across the battlefield. The Allies surged forward, bayonets glinting, drums thundering like a heartbeat of defiance. The French answered with fury, their lines holding firm. The village of Blenheim became a cauldron of fire and blood, where men fought in narrow streets, musket to musket, blade to blade. The air was thick with cries, smoke, and the sound of splintering wood. Yet Marlborough remained composed, his eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the right moment. Hours passed like lifetimes. The French thought they had the upper hand. Tallard laughed as he saw the Allied left wing bend under pressure. He believed Marlborough was breaking. But this was exactly what Marlborough wanted. He had ordered his troops to give ground slowly, to lure the French deeper and deeper into the trap. Each step they took forward brought them closer to destruction. Then, at the height of the chaos, Marlborough unleashed his cavalry, thousands of riders thundering across the fields like a storm. The French lines shattered. Confusion rippled through their ranks as Marlborough's infantry surged again, cutting through the center with ruthless precision. By midday, what had started as a confident French advance turned into panic. Tallard tried to rally his men, but his voice was lost in the chaos. He looked around and saw his army collapsing, the Danube at their backs leaving no room to retreat. Thousands were trapped, their only escape into the river. The water turned dark with the weight of their desperation. Marlborough's forces pressed forward relentlessly, discipline holding them steady as the enemy crumbled. It wasn't brute strength that won the day, it was strategy, timing, and the refusal to surrender to fear through the smoke and screams. Marlborough rode forward, his white horse streaked with mud and blood. His officers saluted him, their faces marked by exhaustion and awe. He had done what no one believed possible. He had defeated the greatest army in Europe against all odds. But there was no triumph in his eyes, only quiet resolve. He knew the battle was not about glory. It was about balance, about preserving a fragile peace that could have been lost forever. Behind him, the field of Blenheim was littered with the remnants of war, broken flags, fallen men, and the silence that follows victory. The French dream of dominance had been shattered in a single day. The myth of invincibility surrounding Louis XIV's armies was gone. Europe would remember this day not as a clash of armies, but as a turning point in history. Marlborough had rewritten the fate of nations with courage, discipline, and genius. And as the sun set over the blood-soaked fields, the world began to understand that one mind, steady and unshaken, can indeed change the course of history. Imagine a continent trembling under the shadow of one king's ambition. France, led by Louis XIV, the Sun King, stood unchallenged, its armies feared across Europe. From Flanders to the Pyrenees, his banners waved over conquered lands. The dream of French supremacy was nearly complete. Only one obstacle remained, the alliance of England, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, bound together by desperation. If the French crushed them now, there would be no one left to resist. The fate of Europe rested not on a throne, but in the mind of one man, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. It was the summer of 1704, and Marlborough had done the impossible. He had marched his army over 250 miles from the Low Countries, through rivers, forests, and hostile terrain, to meet the French near the Danube River. It was a journey so bold that even his allies doubted his sanity. Yet Marlborough's strategy was not madness, it was vision. He knew that to save Vienna from falling, he had to strike fast and hard, deep within enemy lines. This was not a campaign of chance. It was a calculated gamble by a man who saw patterns in chaos and opportunity, where others saw defeat, as his troops assembled near the small Bavarian village of Blenheim soon. To be immortalized as Blenheim, the air was thick with tension. The Allied forces numbered around 56,000, facing nearly 60,000 French and Bavarians under two of the most experienced generals of the age, Marshal Tallard and the Elector of Bavaria. To the French, victory seemed inevitable. They held stronger ground, a fortified line stretching across villages and fields, their rear protected by the river. They laughed at the idea of the English challenging them here. Yet beneath their confidence, they failed to notice how Marlborough watched everything: the river's curve, the slope of the land, the timing of the light. On the night before the battle, he walked silently among his men. Many were weary from the long march, their boots torn, uniforms tattered, but their spirits were unbroken. Marlborough's presence alone carried power. He was not a commander who ruled by fear, but by calm authority. When he spoke, his voice was low yet certain. He told his soldiers that they were fighting not for conquest, but for balance, for the freedom of nations to stand on their own, for the right of generations to live beyond the reach of one tyrant's will. His words sank into their hearts like iron. When he rode away, the camp was quiet, but the fire in their spirits burned brighter than the torches around them. Dawn came with a cold mist rolling over the fields. The French lines glimmered in the distance, a sea of armor and banners. Marlborough's second-in-command, Prince Eugene of Savoy, held the right wing of the Allied army. Together, they coordinated a plan that few could comprehend. While Eugene would engage the Bavarians on one side, Marlborough would strike the French left and centre, drawing them into a trap that would unfold like a storm from silence. The first cannon fired just after sunrise, its echo rolling across the Danube valley. Within moments, the ground shook with the rhythm of war. The Battle of Blenheim had begun. Smoke thickened the air, obscuring the horizon. Soldiers advanced through mud and grass, slick with morning dew, their boots sinking deep with each step. The French opened fire with disciplined volleys, their musket lines lighting up like a wall of fire. Men fell, the cries of the wounded mixing with the clash of steel and thunder of horses. Yet Marlborough pressed on, unmoved by the chaos around him. His genius lay not in brute force, but in timing. Every move he made had purpose. When the French sent reinforcements to Blenheim, thinking it was the main attack, they weakened their own centre. Marlborough saw it immediately. He ordered his... History remembers conquerors, but Blenheim remembers a strategist. Marlborough did not lead with rage or ego. He led with clarity, precision, and control. While others sought glory, he sought balance. His mind was his greatest weapon, sharper than any sword, faster than any cavalry charge. In 1704, as the armies of France and Bavaria assembled along the Danube, most saw an impossible fight. But Marlborough saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. Every river bend, every rise in the ground, every patch of forest was a piece of that puzzle. And when they all came together, he saw a pattern that others were blind to. He knew victory wasn't about numbers. It was about understanding the flow of battle before it even began. The morning of August 13th began with silence. A silence that hung heavy over the fields near the small village of Blenheim. Soldiers stood ready, gripping muskets slick with dew, hearts pounding beneath armour and coats. They knew the French were near, hidden beyond the mist. Somewhere across that field waited the strongest army in Europe, confident in its might and unshaken by past defeats. The French generals, Tallard and Marsin, had every reason to believe they would crush the Allies. They had superior numbers, fortified positions, and the backing of the most powerful king in the world. Marlborough had none of that, but he had vision. He rode along the lines, inspecting his troops with calm composure. His voice was steady when he spoke, measured and deliberate. His soldiers drew courage, not from loud words, but from his silence, from the way he carried himself like a man who already saw the outcome. Every movement of his army was calculated, every order designed not for the moment, but for the hours that would follow. He knew Tallard would underestimate him, that the French pride would blind them to subtlety. He would not defeat them through brute force. He would let their arrogance undo them. The battle began with cannon fire that tore through the morning haze. The sound rolled like thunder, and the sky filled with smoke. The French opened fire with confidence, expecting the Allies to buckle. But Marlborough's line held firm, disciplined, and steady. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos, a swirl of cavalry, infantry, and artillery clashing in violent bursts. But to Marlborough, it was rhythm. He could sense the pulse of battle, when to push, when to pull back, when to let the enemy believe they were winning. At Blenheim village, his men fought fiercely, each street becoming a trap for the enemy. Houses burned, walls collapsed, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the relentless drumming of musket fire. The French committed more and more troops to hold the village, believing it was the key to victory. But Marlborough had planned it that way. He wanted them there, clustered, trapped, too deep to retreat. Every soldier they sent to Blenheim weakened their centre, and every minute that passed tightened his grip on the battlefield. He studied every movement like a mathematician studies numbers. He watched for hesitation, for the small breaks in coordination that signaled panic. When he saw them, he struck without mercy. He ordered cavalry to sweep around the flanks, not to destroy, but to provoke. He made the French believe his right wing was collapsing, forcing Tallard to shift his forces to exploit what he thought was a weakness. But that weakness was bait. Marlborough had drawn him in, stretched his line thin, and left his centre vulnerable. It was the kind of tactical deception that few could execute with such precision. As the day wore on, the battlefield became a storm of smoke, fire, and confusion. The ground was soaked with blood, churned into mud by the boots of thousands. The air trembled with cannon blasts. Even amidst the chaos, Marlborough's focus did not waver. His aides brought reports, his officers awaited orders, but he needed no time to think. His instincts were faster than words. He issued commands as if he were directing a symphony, each section playing its part at exactly the right moment. When the moment came, he struck with overwhelming force. His cavalry, held in reserve for hours, charged through the center with thunderous momentum. Horses tore across the field, sabers flashing in the sunlight. The French center buckled, unable to hold against the sudden fury. What had looked like a stalemate turned in an instant. Marlborough's infantry advanced behind the cavalry, bayonets fixed, cutting through what remained of the enemy's resistance. Tallard tried to rally his men, shouting commands through the smoke, but panic spread faster than his voice. The French soldiers, trapped between the Allies and the river, began to break. Some threw down their weapons, others tried to flee toward the Danube. The riverbanks became scenes of chaos, horses and men struggling, drowning, the water turning dark with their desperation. The mighty army of France, which had never known defeat on such a scale, was collapsing before the eyes of its commander. Marlborough rode into the fray, not to gloat, but to guide. His eyes moved constantly, calculating distances, assessing where the lines were strongest and weakest. His horse galloped through mud and bodies, his uniform smeared with dust and smoke. Officers saluted as he passed, their morale rising at the sight of his calm amid destruction. He gave no speeches, no grand gestures. He simply moved with purpose, his presence alone a reminder that order still existed in the heart of chaos. By late afternoon, the field was littered with the wreckage of two armies. The French dream of domination lay shattered. Marlborough had captured Marshal Tallard himself and taken thousands of prisoners. Yet when his officers congratulated him, he did not smile. His face was pale and still, as though he understood something deeper, that this was not triumph but transformation. The balance of power in Europe had shifted. One man's mind had altered the fate of nations. The men who survived the battle would later speak of how Marlborough seemed to know the enemy's every move before it happened. They said he saw through the smoke, as if the fog of war could not touch him. In truth, it was not magic but mastery, the mastery of focus, patience, and restraint. He never fought for the noise of glory, never for the applause of kings. He fought because he understood that leadership is not about commanding men. It is about commanding oneself. He never allowed panic to dictate his decisions, never let pride cloud his vision. He proved that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is a mind that stays calm when the world burns around it. As evening descended, the last echoes of battle faded into the wind. Fires smoldered across the fields, casting long shadows over the fallen. Marlborough's soldiers, exhausted and bloodied, began to gather, their faces reflecting both sorrow and pride. They had done the impossible. The armies of Louis XIV had been broken, their aura of invincibility destroyed. The Allies had saved Vienna, saved the Empire, and preserved a Europe that would have otherwise fallen under absolute rule. Marlborough rode among them, his head bowed slightly, his expression unreadable. The cheers of victory rose around him, but he did not lift his hand in triumph. He was already thinking of the next move, the next battle, the next challenge that would test his resolve once more. The fields of Blenheim lay silent now, but silence never tells the full story. The echoes of that day still lived in the hearts of men who had seen it, the clash of iron, the thunder of hooves, the roar of cannon fire that shook the sky. It was not just a battle of armies. It was a test of vision, endurance, and will. Marlborough's triumph was not born from luck or chance. It was built upon courage forged through hardship and a mind unbroken by doubt. Every victory he earned came from seeing order in the chaos when others only saw fear. As dusk settled on the fields of Bavaria, he stood not as a conqueror, but as a man who had outthought an empire. For the soldiers who survived, the memory of that day would never fade. They had marched through rivers, mud, and hunger to reach this place. They had fought not for riches or titles, but for the cause of balance, for the chance to hold back the tide that threatened to swallow their world. They saw friends fall beside them, and yet they never faltered. Each man in that army knew that the Duke's calm meant something greater than confidence. It meant he saw beyond the moment, beyond the fear, beyond the pain. He had taught them that discipline could conquer chaos, that unity could overpower pride. The aftermath of Blenheim stretched far beyond the battlefield. News of the victory spread like fire across Europe. In Paris, the courtiers of Louis XIV stood in stunned silence as the reports arrived. The king who had ruled with unmatched power faced the first true wound to his pride. His army, once the envy of the world, was broken. His Marshal Tallard was a prisoner in English hands. The myth of French invincibility had vanished in a single day. Across the continent, nations that had lived in fear began to hope again. The dream of one king dominating Europe was over, and the balance Marlborough had fought to preserve began to take root. Yet Marlborough himself sought no celebration. When he returned to his tent that night, he did not feast or boast. He sat in quiet reflection, surrounded by maps and letters. The flicker of a candle cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the fatigue that battle could not hide. To him, victory was never an end. It was a responsibility. He thought of the lives lost, the men who would never return home, the families who would wait in vain. He carried their memory with him as part of the cost of command. Leadership had never been about glory to him. It was a burden, one that demanded everything from the mind and the soul. Far from the battlefield, in courts and palaces, the meaning of Blenheim was being debated. Politicians spoke of alliances, treaties, and power shifts, but few understood the real lesson of that day. Blenheim was not merely about who won or lost. It was about the triumph of intellect over arrogance, unity over division, strategy over strength. It was the moment when Europe learned that the greatest victories are not won by armies alone, but by those who can see beyond the fog of war, who can think when others panic, and who can act when others hesitate. For Marlborough, the victory brought fame and suspicion in equal measure. Some envied his success. Others feared his influence, yet he never wavered. He continued to lead, campaign after campaign, always with the same calm presence that had defined him at Blenheim. His soldiers followed him, not because of his titles or rewards, but because they trusted his vision. They knew that behind every command was purpose, behind every risk was calculation. He never gambled lives recklessly. He moved like a chess master who already saw the board several moves ahead. Years later, when historians would write about Blenheim, they would speak of tactics, formations, and numbers. They would describe how Marlborough's flanking maneuvers trapped the French, how his coordination with Prince Eugene of Savoy created a perfect balance of offense and defense. They would dissect his brilliance like scholars analyzing art. But those who had stood beside him that day knew it was more than strategy. It was will. It was the unshakable belief that no force, no empire, no king could stand forever if opposed by courage and reason united. The landscape itself bore witness to that truth. The once green fields were scarred with trenches, broken cannons, and the ruins of Blenheim village. But from those scars, the seeds of a new era were sown. Europe began to shift, power began to balance, and nations that had cowered under the might of France found their voice again. Marlborough's victory had not only saved Vienna, it had saved the idea of a free Europe. It showed that even in an age of kings and empires, one mind could alter the destiny of millions. When Marlborough finally departed from Blenheim, he did not look back. His work was not done. His wars were not over. But in that moment, the weight of history already rested upon him. His name would be written among the great tacticians of all time, alongside Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon yet to come. But unlike them, his legacy was not one of conquest. It was one of preservation. He fought not to expand his own power, but to restrain another's. He fought to maintain the fragile equilibrium that kept nations free from the shadow of absolute rule. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the fires across the battlefield dimmed, he stood alone for a moment, breathing the cold air that carried both the memory of war and the promise of peace. The horizon was still dark, but somewhere within that darkness was the faint glow of the future he had helped shape. He knew the struggle would continue, that the peace he fought for would always be fragile, always tested. Yet he also knew that Blenheim had proven something eternal, that strategy, courage, and unity could rewrite destiny, even when the world seemed lost. In the years that followed Blenheim, Marlborough's name became legend, but legends are built on more than victory. They are built on endurance, on the quiet strength to carry burdens that few can see. The battle had changed Europe, but it had also changed him. The cheers of London and Vienna could not drown out the memories that haunted his thoughts. He could still hear the thunder of cannons, still see the faces of men who had followed him into the fire and never returned. He had won not just through brilliance, but through a relentless sense of purpose that refused to bend under the weight of responsibility. To the world he was a hero. To himself he was a guardian of balance, fighting not for conquest, but to prevent chaos from consuming everything he had sworn to protect. Even after victory, his work did not end. The War of the Spanish Succession raged on, and every decision carried consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. Kings and ministers sought his counsel, yet many envied the influence he commanded. Politics became another war, quieter but no less dangerous. Marlborough navigated it with the same discipline he had shown in battle, never allowing emotion to cloud judgment. He understood that true leadership demanded not only courage in war, but restraint in peace. He fought not for his own name, but for the stability of nations that had once stood at the edge of collapse. His allies admired him, his enemies respected him, and yet the crown he served began to doubt him. Success breeds suspicion, and even the greatest victories can become shadows in the halls of power. But Marlborough never responded with anger. He understood that greatness is rarely loved by those it serves. What mattered to him was not recognition, but results. The same patience that had carried him through the fog of Blenheim carried him through the intrigues of courts and councils. He had learned that power could be fleeting, but integrity could not be taken away. He spent his nights not in celebration, but in planning, poring over maps, predicting movements, anticipating threats. Every new campaign was a new puzzle, every battle a test of timing and will. He never repeated himself, never relied on the same strategy twice. To him, predictability was weakness, and the mind of a commander had to remain fluid, adaptable, alive. Those who studied his methods said he seemed to fight wars in his head long before they began on the field. He believed that victory belonged to those who could think clearly in confusion, those who could see light when others saw only smoke. The men who served under him never forgot his calm. They said that when everything seemed lost, when gunfire roared and fear spread like wildfire, one look at Marlborough was enough to steady their hearts. He was not loud or theatrical. His strength was quiet, deliberate. He never commanded with pride, but with purpose. His confidence came from preparation, from knowing that every risk he took had been weighed, every move measured. To his soldiers, he was proof that leadership was not about shouting orders, but about inspiring trust. They followed him not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. Yet even the greatest minds cannot escape time. As the years passed, the wars took their toll. His hair grayed, his steps slowed, but his mind remained sharp as ever. The young officers, who now looked to him for guidance, saw not just a general, but a living symbol of what strategy and conviction could achieve. He had become more than a commander. He was a teacher of endurance, a reminder that discipline and patience could outlast any storm. When he stood in quiet moments, watching the sun fall over distant fields, he often thought of how fragile peace could be. He had fought his wars not out of hatred, but because he understood what happened when ambition went unchecked. He had seen empires rise and fall, and he knew that the real battle was not on the field, but within the hearts of men, the struggle between greed and wisdom, pride and restraint. He believed that the greatest victory of all was not defeating an enemy, but mastering one's own desire for power. Those who knew him best said that even in his later years, he carried himself like a man still on campaign, always prepared, always vigilant. He never allowed comfort to soften his will. The same clarity that had guided him through Blenheim guided him through life itself. He had proven that genius alone was not enough. It was discipline that made it unbreakable. His victories had reshaped Europe, but his example reshaped what leadership meant. He showed that one mind, guided by reason and steadiness, could hold back the tide of an empire and redefine the destiny of nations. And so, when the echoes of Blenheim faded and the drums of war fell silent, what remained was not just a field of victory, but the legacy of a man who turned strategy into art and courage into destiny. Marlborough had shown the world that greatness is not born in comfort, but carved through struggle. He proved that one leader, guided by vision instead of vanity, could alter the course of history itself. The Battle of Blenheim did not merely decide a war, it redefined the balance of Europe. Empires rose and fell, crowns changed hands, but his name endured like iron beneath the dust of time. For every era that follows, one truth remains unshaken. Brilliance may win a moment, but discipline wins an age.